All right, so we're supposed to talk about the Megillah tonight. And I suppose that the Megillah is a very strange book when you think about it. There are a lot of questions about the Megillah that go unasked for the simple reason that they're not answerable. In other words, the rabbis in the Gemara Megillah and the rabbis who form the commentaries on the Megillah ask many questions, but usually they ask questions that they have answers for. But they don't ask the questions that there don't seem to be answers for. So I'll give you some examples of questions like that. We know that Esther was brought up by Mordechai. Mordechai was Esther's uncle. But the Gemara in Megillah says unequivocally that when Mordechai's first wife died, then Mordechai married this niece of his whom he had brought up. In other words, Mordechai was not only the uncle of Esther, he was the husband of Esther. Okay? And this is alluded to in the Megillah when it says that he took her for his household, and we know that household is a euphemism for wife. Beso Ishto. Beso ze Ishto, that a man's household, that is his wife. And so when Vashti was killed, and Achashverosh decided that he wants all the virgins in the land that are pretty, good-looking, brought to him, so that he could decide whom to choose for the next queen, we know that Esther got picked up off the street, and she was brought to the palace of Achashverosh. We also know that she never got in to see Achashverosh for at least 6 months. In fact, there was more than that. And she had to be taught etiquette, and she had to be bathed in various kinds of perfumes, and she had to be clothed in very, very nice clothing. And so by the time she got to see Achashverosh, many, many months had elapsed. In fact, I think probably close to a year, not more. I remember the exact language of the Megillah. Mordechai was the chief rabbi of Persia. He lived b'chatzar Beis HaMelech. He lived in that neighborhood just adjacent to the palace that was reserved for nobility, for politicians. He was very well known to the royalty in Persia at that time. The question then is, if Mordechai comes home one night to his own house and finds out that his wife, Esther, was picked up by the soldiers who were trying to find virgins to bring to Achashverosh, why didn't he simply go next door to the palace, knock on the door of some minor dignitary, and say, I happen to be the chief rabbi of Persia. I think that your soldiers made a mistake. They have taken my wife, and she is now with those other women who is trying out for the queenship of this country. Would you mind returning her to me? This minor dignitary would have probably become quite embarrassed and said, well, wow, we weren't supposed to pick up married women. We're terribly sorry, Rabbi, and you are, after all, the head of the Jewish community, and certainly, here, take her home. We don't find any such tale in the Megillah. We find that Esther was taken to the house, to the palace of Achashverosh, and there she remained. Why did Mordechai try to get her back? You can't tell me because Achashverosh was madly in love with her, she never got in to see Achashverosh for about a year. Why couldn't he attempt at least to get her back? We have no record of any such attempt. Secondly, we find that when Esther first came into the palace, Daniel was still alive. He certainly knew who she was. Eventually, when she was chosen by Ahasuerus to be the next queen, they made a big banquet, and it was very widely publicized and well attended. How could it be that the entire Jewish community kept this a secret? That Ahasuerus never found out that Esther was the wife of Mordecai, or in fact that Esther was a member of the Jewish community. I mean, could you imagine if, let's say, the chief rabbi of Israel had a wife who suddenly wound up marrying the President of the United States? I mean, what chance would there have been of, or could there be of keeping such thing a secret? How was it possible for the Jewish community to keep this thing such a secret that Ahasuerus never found out? And thirdly, we find that when the story of Purim comes to a close, when the Jewish people are rescued from the threat of Haman, then it says, Kimu v'kiblu ha-Yehudim, that the Jewish people re-accepted. They accepted the holiday, but the Gemara in Megillah says, Kimu v'kiblu ha-Yehudim, that the Jewish people rededicated themselves to fulfill what they had already received at Sinai. They rededicated themselves to the Torah. And if you remember the Gemara in Shabbos, page 88, the Gemara says that when the Jewish people stood around Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, Kafa Aleh Pesahar Kegigos, God picked up the mountain of Sinai over their heads like a cone and said, if you do not agree to accept the Torah, this will be your burial place. And so the Gemara there in Shabbos says, well, then it isn't fair. I mean, they accepted the Torah under duress. How could they be bound for eternity on the basis of such acceptance? And the Gemara answers, well, don't worry about it. During the time of Mordecai and Esther, they re-accepted the Torah of their own volition. And the Jewish people at the time of Mordecai and Esther voluntarily agreed to accept the Torah, and so don't worry about the fact that they were forced at first. On this Gemara in Shabbos, there's a Tosfos. And Tosfos says, well, wait a minute. We see that the Jewish people of their own volition voluntarily accepted the Torah when it was given at Sinai. After all, they said, Nasa v'nishma, anything that you tell us, God, we're prepared to do, even though we don't know what it is you're going to tell us. God made a covenant with them a number of times during the generation of Sinai, not only at the mountain. How can you say the Jewish people were forced to accept the Torah? Tosfos answers that really what they couldn't have accepted was things like the Megillah, which hadn't been given yet. And the other commentaries like the Maharshal, they say, well, in other words, the Jewish people had to be threatened insofar as the acceptance of the law, oral law, was concerned. There were certain aspects of the Torah that the Jewish people weren't yet fully in touch with, and they hesitated in terms of accepting, and it was in terms of those aspects of the oral law that God had to threaten them. In which case, when the story of Purim is concluded, and the verse says, Kimu v'kiblu ha-Yehudim, that the Jewish people agreed to re-accept the Torah, mainly, according to Rabbi Tzadok of Lublin, mainly what they were rededicating themselves to was the tradition of the oral law, the Torah Shebal Peh. Okay. Comes the big question. What in heaven's name does the story of Purim in any way, shape, or form have to do with a rededication to oral law on the part of the Jews who lived in the time of Purim to a greater extent than was possible even at Sinai? What in the world does the oral law have to do with rededication to it with the story of Purim? These are some of the questions that nobody asks. Okay? They're not asked because generally, what are you going to say? Now let's back up a little bit. Let's remember that historically, the Jewish people who lived in Shushan were basically assimilated Jews. They might have been Shomei Shabbat, they might have even put on tefillin, and many of them probably didn't even do that. They were very assimilated into the Persian culture of the time. We have a little bit of a proof of this in that the story of the Megillah begins with the Sudas, also Rasha as it is known in the Gemara, with the meal that Achashverosh made, the great banquet that he gave, to which he invited members, representatives of all of the communities in or under his domain. And according to the Gemara and Megillah, the heads of the Jewish community came to Mordechai, who was their chief rabbi, and asked whether it was advisable to attend this banquet. And he said, no, don't go near the place. They didn't listen. After all, how can you pass up an opportunity of dining with the elite, with really being part of the culture of the time? They wanted to be accepted as part of the whole of the people. They were somewhat assimilated. When they came to that banquet, they were given wine that wasn't kosher. They became drunk. They were served food on utensils that were taken by the Nebuchadnezzar, which had been inherited in turn by Achashverosh and his wife Vashti. They were served non-kosher food off the vessels that were used in their holy temple in Jerusalem. In short, in the aftermath of it all, the Jewish people realized that part of what had happened at this festive banquet was that they had been put down, that they had been made fun of, their heritage had been held up to ridicule. They recognized the fact that though they were trying to assimilate, that very attempt was utilized by the people whom they wanted so much to be a part of as a means of degradation. And so what I want to do now is explain the thread of Haman, who we know was from the offspring of Amalek. The verse proclaims that there will be a war between God and the nation of Amalek from generation to generation. And God's name and his throne will be lacking completion until Amalek is wiped out from under the heavens. What is this business of Amalek? Before Purim, there's Parsha Zochar. We read in every synagogue where it tells us to remember what Amalek did to us, to eradicate his name. What is the threat of Amalek? Today we no longer know who comes from Amalek. There are individuals left of that tribe, but we don't know who they are. yet we have a positive commandment in the Torah that we have to remember what Amalek did to us. We have to wipe out Amalek. What does that mean today, to wipe out Amalek? The first hint of what it means is perhaps found in the Zohar Kodesh. The Zohar says that Amalek is the gematria suffix, that Amalek equals the word suffix. In Hebrew, every Hebrew word has a numerical value, since every letter in the Hebrew alphabet is associated with a number. Therefore, the word Amalek equals the same number as the word Safek, which means to doubt. In short, Amalek comes to cause the Jewish people to doubt the validity of God's existence, perhaps, but certainly to doubt the relationship and with all of its uniqueness that they, the Jewish people, have with God. In short, Amalek comes to make the Jewish people doubt their chosenness. That's what Amalek does. What's interesting is that in all of the Midrashim, we find that Amalek is associated with the Nachash HaKadmoni, with the serpent who tempted Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. We have an allusion to that when it tells us in Deuteronomy 25:17, Zocha is asher asal cha Amalek. You should remember what Amalek did to you, Baderech b'tzeischa miMitzrayim, on the way when you left Egypt. Asher karacha baderech, he met up with you in the way. V'yazaniv b'cho kol hanachashalim acharecha, and he smote those people who walked behind or in the rear. V'yatam oyev v'yoyev v'lomer elokim, and you, meaning the Jewish people, were faint and weary, and he feared not God. And so Amalek sneaks up behind the Jewish people and gets them when he takes them by surprise. In other words, he smites in you all of those who are behind. The word for behind, nechasholim, who are sort of crawling behind. The word nechasholim, the root of that word is nachash, which means serpent. And so Amalek's power is to creep up from behind in a way that's least expected, like the serpent, like a snake who creeps and crawls up, attacks a person when he's not aware. So let's try to understand about the serpent, because if Amalek and the serpent are somehow rooted one in the other, then a better understanding of the serpent is necessary at this point. The serpent was put in the garden to test Adam and Eve. That's obvious. Why is the serpent punished? Because he went beyond the degree of testing he was meant to do. He falsified God's intention. He was supposed to come into the garden and tempt Adam and Eve to eat from the tree by saying, look, it looks good, the tree, it smells good, the tree, probably tastes good, go ahead and eat from it, isn't it delicious, right? But what does the serpent do? He goes beyond the call of duty, and he misleads Eve. Why does he go beyond the call of duty? Why doesn't he just tempt Adam and Eve in the way that he was meant to tempt them? Because the serpent is jealous of Adam and Eve. He recognizes that Adam and Eve have a special purpose to fulfill in the universe. One which he, the serpent, has no part of. Why should they be given opportunity that I wasn't given? Asked the serpent. The serpent feels that there's no equality. God created him, the serpent, and God created Adam and Eve, and yet Adam and Eve have greater opportunity than I, the serpent. And so the serpent goes out of his way to cause Adam and Eve to sin. He wants to show them up. He wants to prove to God that they are not worthy of the opportunities that God has in store for them. How does he finally get Eve to eat? He never, if you look carefully into the verses concerning Adam and Eve and the serpent, you will find that the serpent never contradicts God. Eve says, God told me not to eat from the tree. The serpent says, right. He doesn't call Eve a liar. He doesn't say that she's mistaken. Yet, he says to Eve, if you will eat from the tree, this is according to Rashi and the Midrashic material, if you will eat from the tree, you will be like God, and you will be able to create universes like He. What does that mean? What's he telling you? He's learning a different pshat. He's giving a different understanding to what God said to Eve. Up until now, Eve understands God as having said, do not eat from this tree of wisdom, of good and evil, lest you die. Simple enough. What's the test? The test is the tree looks good, and probably tastes good, and it smells good. Well, the test is whether or not I can withstand temptation and lust and hold myself back from eating from it. That's how Eve understands the test. Serpent comes around and says, hey, listen, God is all powerful. If He didn't want you to eat from that tree, if He really didn't want you to eat from the tree, He would have made it impossible for you to have done so. That's number one. The fact that He tells you not to eat from it and still makes it possible for you to go ahead and do so means He's not really sold on the idea that you shouldn't eat from it. That's number one. Number two, why were you put in the world? Obviously, you were put in the world, created the image of God, to emulate your Creator. So now let me ask you something. What is the greatest gift that God has bestowed upon you and your husband? Freedom of choice. You can do as you choose. You have to really value that gift. I mean, if you're supposed to be created in the image of God, and if you're meant to emulate God, well, then let me ask you a question, says the serpent. Does God have a higher God that He must acquiesce His will to? God doesn't take orders from anybody. God has absolute choice. He's in absolute control. He never has to make His own will subservient to any other force but Himself. Now, if you really value the choice God bestowed upon you, you will always cherish that choice. And by cherishing the choice, I mean you will never acquiesce or make that choice subservient to anybody or anything, not even God Himself. Then you will really be emulating God. So when God tells you not to eat from the tree and yet He lets eating be possible, you're misunderstanding the test. You think that He really doesn't want you to eat from the tree and that's the test. I'm telling you the test is something completely different. The test is to see how much you value independent choice and whether you will make that choice subservient to anybody or anything, including God. And if you pass this test and don't listen to God and eat from the tree anyway, you will prove to God how much you value the gift of choice, and then he will know that you are truly emulating himself, and he will give you the power to create worlds like himself. Okay? and so Eve falls for it, and she eats from the tree. All right? Because Eve is an emotional being. Had he did the same thing, had he said the same thing to Adam, Adam wouldn't have fallen for it. Why not? Because Adam would have said, well, look, it's true God doesn't make his choice subservient to any higher God. But God can do anything. And in order to create, he has to do away with certain choices and choose to actualize other choices. Therefore, God makes subservient certain of his choices to himself in order to create, because it's impossible to do any productive thing unless a person knows restraint and is able to limit choice in one area in order to make manifest choice in another area so that creativity can take place. But Eve didn't think about it like that, and so she went and shaved from the tree. In short, what did the serpent do to Eve? He made her doubt what her test was. He inserted doubt in her mind. She understood the test correctly to begin with. Serpent came around, and he learned a different shot. He understood it. He interpreted what was happening in a different way, and she fell for it because he placed some seed of doubt in her mind as to what God really expected from her in the light of the test she was obviously having to cope with. Hence, the serpent instills doubt, suffix. What does Amalek do? Amalek is Begematria suffix. Amalek makes the Jews doubt their relationship with God. When does Amalek attack the Jewish people? Amalek attacks the Jewish people the moment they leave Egypt. I realize. When the Jewish people are rescued by God from Egypt, Amalek comes and attacks them. You know what the Midrash says? The Midrash says that Amalek believes in God, but hates him. Amalek believes in God, but hates him. Why should Amalek believe in God and hate him? I'll tell you what. Amalek feels that God is unfair. Amalek feels that God plays favorites. Amalek believes that there is no equality in the universe. Why does Amalek believe that? Because Amalek hears from the Jewish people that they have a special relationship with God. They stood at Sinai, God made a covenant with them. The covenant is based on some kind of unconditional love. If their well-being is jeopardized to the point that physically there's no way for them to save themselves, God will intercede in their behalf. And in fact, when Amalek saw that all of this was true, that God, through miraculous means, rescued the Jewish people from Egypt, he said, oh, God is playing favorites. He's interceding in ways that are miraculous for a chosen people. At that point, Amalek attacks Israel. Amalek attacks Israel because he's jealous of Israel and Israel's relationship with God, just like the serpent was jealous of Adam and Eve and their relationship with God. Amalek wants to discredit the Jewish people. He wants them to doubt their own chosenness. And look what happens psychologically. When the Jewish people were in Egypt, they didn't have to lift a finger. God helped them with 10 plagues, with the splitting of the Red Sea, He eventually brought them to Sinai. All of this was miraculous. The Jewish people were beginning to feel that they have such a wonderful, close relationship with God, that they'll never ever have to fight a war. They'll be protected perpetually by God and God's spiritual influence. Suddenly they find themselves in the desert, being attacked by this nation Amalek, and God is not making any miracles. They have to defend themselves. So they begin to doubt, maybe we were wrong. Maybe we really don't have such a great close relationship with God. Or maybe God, for some reason we can't understand, is intimidated by this nation of Amalek and is afraid to fight them. Right? Therefore, Amalek comes to destroy, or at least shed doubt on the Jewish concept of chosenness. Amalek makes the Jewish people doubt their relationship with God. Therefore, we have an amazing thing. Everybody has heard the story of Cain and Abel. Cain was the first human being to be born of human parents. He was the first child of Adam and Eve. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says that besides causing Eve to eat from the tree, Eve was seduced by the serpent. Whatever that means, it's a metaphor. According to the Zohar, we're not to take that literally. But nevertheless, the Gemara says in Sanhedrin that Eve was seduced by the serpent. And when Adam then went ahead and lived with his wife Eve, his sperm mingled with the poison of the serpent, which produced Cain. Now Cain is half the son of Adam and Eve, the Yotzei Kapot Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who were designed by God's hand. And on the other hand, Cain is influenced by the poison of the serpent. How do we see this? Cain is jealous of his brother Abel. Abel is born with two twin sisters. We know this because it says S twice surrounding the birth of Abel. And S, the word S has no literal translation, but it's l'rabot according to the Gemara. It comes to add. And the rabbis teach us that it says S twice around the birth of Abel to tell us that he was born, Abel that is, with two twin sisters. Cain, the word S is only used once in connection with his birth, to let us know that he was born with only one twin sister. And in those days, since there weren't very many people populating the universe, one married his own twin sisters. Thus, Abel, who is the younger brother, is born with two twin sisters and has twice the opportunity to achieve immortality through his children, as does his older brother Cain. And Cain is hopping mad. He's very upset. Why is he upset? Because he says to himself, well, look, if somehow God gave me only one sister after I lived a couple of years of my life and sinned, I can understand. Maybe I did something wrong to deserve less potential, less opportunity. But we were born the way we were born. My brother was born with two twin sisters and twice the opportunity at immortality than myself. I was only born with one twin sister, one wife. That's not fair. You can't say that God had any purpose that anybody can understand in doing a thing like that. I mean, obviously God just deals with the world randomly. He just sort of, flips a coin. This one two sisters, this one sister. It's not fair. And so Cain is terribly jealous of his brother Abel. Okay. But that jealousy is coming from the poison of the snake, which is part of his consciousness. On the other hand, Cain is the son of Adam and Eve. He really believes in God. He doesn't want to turn his back on God. He wants to have a relationship with God. In fact, he wants to tell God how he's feeling. And so Cain goes and offers up a sacrifice. And in those days, a sacrifice was more or less a symbolic way of acting out what we today do when we pray. And so Cain goes and he brings a sacrifice. And then the verse says, Vehevel hevi gam hu korban la'Hashem. That Abel also brought a sacrifice to God. But who had the idea to relate to God through a sacrifice first? Cain, because Cain in a certain way is a very great person. Hevel comes, he jumps on the bandwagon and brings a sacrifice only after he sees the example of his brother. What did Cain bring for a sacrifice? Well, according to Rashi and according to the Midrash, Cain was a farmer. He went out into his field, and the first thing that came into his hand, the first thing that his hand happened to touch, he said, great, and he put it on the altar. What was that? Flax seeds, which aren't worth very much, very cheap. Right? The question is, why is he bringing, he's offering a sacrifice, why is he bringing this cheap first thing that comes into his hand? Very simple. Why? Because the sacrifice, don't forget, the word sacrifice is korban. It comes from the word korav, to come close to God. He wants to draw close to God and explain to God how he's been feeling. And how has he been feeling? Pretty lousy. He feels that God randomly deals out opportunities to the world. So he randomly goes out into his field, and anything that happens to come into his hand, he throws on the altar. In other words, God, I'm giving back to you in the way that I experience you having given to me. Now, God doesn't accept the sacrifice of Cain, but he doesn't punish Cain either. In fact, he comes and he talks to him and so on and so forth. But what's interesting here is that Cain, who is influenced by the Nachash, by the serpent, carries in the bloodstream of his soul a kind of jealousy. He harbors a notion that God randomly doles out opportunities to people unjustly. God plays favorites, and he can't stand the idea that God plays favorites. He feels that the justice scales of heaven are unbalanced. This explains something very, very important. Because in the book of Deuteronomy 25:13, we have a warning. Thou shalt not have in thy bag diverse weights, a great and a small. Thou shalt not have in thy house diverse measures, a great and a small. A perfect and just weight shalt thou have. A perfect and just measure shalt thou have. In other words, there's a warning here that a man who's a storekeeper who has to weigh out things for customers shouldn't put loaded weights and measures on his scale. He should deal justly. You know what follows immediately after that warning? Remember what Amalek did unto you by the way as you came forth out of Egypt. How he met thee by the way and smote the hindmost of thee. Says the Rogatchover Gaon, why is it that we talk about Amalek right after the warning about false weights? Says the Rogatchover, because Amalek hates God. He feels that the balance scales in heaven are out of whack, that God is playing favorites, that God hasn't chosen people and he's jealous. If you will be dishonest in terms of your weights and measures, Israel, then you don't deserve to be the chosen people. And so the whole question of whether or not the balance scales in heaven are just will be aroused amongst the nations. People will come to doubt the chosenness of Israel or the selection of God. Thus, by dealing falsely in weights and measures, the Jewish people arouse upon themselves the harsh decree amongst the other nations of the world who fall away from a recognition of their specialness and begin to doubt the weights and measures in heaven. Okay, very interesting. Now let's see what happens further. Getting back to the story of birth. The Jewish people, the Gemara says, what did they deserve? What did they do that caused them to deserve the threat of extinction through Haman? The Gemara says what they did was they attended the Sudas Osirasha. They came to the feast of Achashverosh. And as I explained earlier, when they came to that feast, they were disgraced. And in the aftermath, they realized that all of this culture that we've been trying to assimilate with ultimately doesn't do us any good. The closer we come to being better goyim than the goyim, the more the goyim resent it. And by goyim is not a derogatory word. It just simply means the nations of the world. And so, at this point, I want to elaborate on the notion of culture and the notion of chosenness. These two things are very bound up. You see, the Jewish people are an Am Segula. Now, an Am Segula means a treasured people, if you must translate the word Segula, and that's a verse of the Bible. It doesn't mean chosen. Am Segula means a treasured people. But a Segula is very hard to translate. It could mean a treasure, but that's not really an adequate translation of the word Segula. Okay. If I had to translate the word Segula into English, the closest I can get to it is the word gestalt and not the therapy. All right? A gestalt means if I do X in Y, every time I do X and Y, I get B. And nobody understands why. It always works like that. You do X and you do Y, you're going to get B. Nobody knows why. There's no relationship that anyone can rationally show between X and Y and B, but every time X and Y is done, you get B. That's what a segula is. That's the meaning of the word gestalt. Okay. In other words, no matter what the Jewish people do, whether right or whether wrong, God's will be done through them. If they behave in a good way as befitting them, then God's will be done through them in a gracious, good way. If they behave wrongly, then the will of God will nevertheless be manifest as a result of what they've done, but in a harsh way, in a way that isn't kind, that isn't very complimentary. Whatever the Jewish people do, ultimately it is through them that God's will, on the deepest level, will be made manifest to humanity. They're an Am Segula, it's a gestalt. They do X and Y, it doesn't matter if they do X, it doesn't matter if they do Y. It doesn't matter if they do good, if they do bad, B is always going to happen. God's will is going to come about through whatever they do. The Jewish people as a nation are the vessels through which God's will is made manifest. God has entered into a covenant with the Jewish people. This covenant is unconditional. All right? There's a difference between covenantal relationship, right, which is translated bris in Hebrew, and shtar, which is a kind of a contractual relationship. If I'm in a contractual relationship with another person, if he goes against some of the things that are specified in the contract, I have a right to disengage from the contract as well. If one of us breaks the contract, the other one automatically moves away. That's a contractual agreement. Bris, covenantal agreement, means I agree to love you, no matter what. And even if you wind up hating me, that doesn't matter. I am going to continue to love you. Right? God has involved himself in a covenantal relationship with the Jewish people, which is based on an ahava she'enu tolei b'dava, on a love that is totally unconditional. Now that doesn't mean that the individual Jew doesn't have responsibility or won't be punished for wrongdoing, but the Jewish nation as a whole, the Jewish people, has a relationship with God as unconditional. Therefore, there are certain guarantees. I've pointed this out very many times. There are certain guarantees in the Torah from God toward the Jewish people. God guarantees, for example, that the Jewish people will never be totally annihilated. Now, if a crazy man goes into the street and starts shooting, well, God also guarantees free choice. He can shoot. If there's a man like Hitler, Yamach Shemo, who kills millions of people, he's got free choice. Until when will a man like Hitler's free choice be allowed to run rampant? Until the promise of God to the Jewish people as a whole is actually in jeopardy. At that point, a bell goes off in heaven, and God will temporarily take away free choice. And he will make a madman like Hitler still a little more mad than he normally was, and he'll cause him, against the advice of all of his generals, to go into Russia before he takes over England, thus losing the war. But it isn't until the agreement that God has covenantally with the Jewish people, that they will never be annihilated totally as a nation. It isn't until this agreement is actually threatened in the eyes of heaven that God is going to interfere with human choice, which otherwise is absolutely guaranteed. Secondly, God guarantees that the Torah will never be forgotten from the Jewish people. No matter how many culture comes, we're going to fight. No matter how many persecutions and exiles we're going to endure, that the Torah will never be cut off from the seed of its people forever and all eternity. Ultimately, there's a guarantee that the Jewish people will be returned to their land. And here we are. Okay? These things are absolute guarantees. No matter how many times we're banished from the land, we're always going to return to the land. And so the end is going to be, we're going to remain in the land once returned. These are guarantees that are unconditional. They are based on an unconditional love that God has with the people, the nation, Israel. On an individual plane, as I said, people are responsible. They will be punished for wrongdoing and given reward for things that they do that are meritorious, and so on and so forth. But on the basis of the Jewish people as a whole, those guarantees which are unconditional apply. And here we've got to understand that the unconditional love, the chosenness of the Jewish people is something that is absolutely beyond reason. Now try to understand. We have a Gemara in Shabbos. It's around page S also, around page 88, where the Gemara says, well, what did the Jewish people ever do to deserve to be such a chosen people, that God should give the Torah through them, and that they should perpetuate and make manifest the message of that Torah for all times to humanity? What did we do to deserve all of this? So the Gemara says, well, when asked whether or not we want to accept the Torah, we answered, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will hear, which was like a quantum leap of faith. We didn't say to God, tell us what's written in the Torah, and we'll decide whether or not we want to abide by those laws. No, we said, God, we love you so much, and we have faith and trust in you to such a degree that whatever you're going to tell us, we're ready to do. We promise we're going to do it, even though we don't know what it is yet. Because the Jewish people accepted the Torah with a quantum leap of faith, unconditional acceptance. God said, okay, my relationship with you as a people will always, for all times, also be unconditional. All right? That's one viewpoint. There's a second viewpoint. And this is a midrash I'm sure you're all familiar with. The midrash says that, when God was about to give the Torah to Israel, he first went around to every nation in the world. And he said, would you like to receive my Torah? And each nation said, well, what's written in the Torah? And when God told them various things, they said, no, it's too much for us. We can't handle that. We don't want the Torah. And eventually, when he came to the Jewish people, they said, Na'aseh v'nishma, unconditional acceptance. No matter what you say, we're ready and prepared to live with. That's why he chose the Jewish people. In the Zohar, you have this amazing thing. The Zohar says, wait a minute. We have no historical record that God ever actually went around to every nation in the world offering them the Torah. When did this happen? Says the Zohar that before the universe was created, God created an angel appointed in heaven to represent every nation that would ever be in the world. And God imbued each of these angels with a real, true perception of the nation that they would be representing. And then he went around and he said to the angels, who were like the leaders in heaven over each nation, well, knowing what you do about the nations you represent, do you want to accept the Torah or not? And each one said, well, given what's written in the Torah, and given the nature that you have given us to understand about the people we're to represent, no way, we can't live with the Torah. Says the Zohar, Chose Kasha L'Duchte. And the question becomes stronger. Hey, wait a minute. If this is true, then God programs the Jewish people to be able to accept the Torah, and he programs nobody else in the world to be able to do the same thing as a nation. Thus it's not fair. Thus there's something about why did he choose the Jewish people? Why did he choose to program just these people and nobody else? We don't know. Now, I'll tell you something really deep. Think about this for a second. What would happen if we did know? What would happen if we could give a rational, objective reason to explain why God chose the Jewish people? Then you know what? God's love for the Jewish people could no longer be unconditional. Because that love would be bound up with whatever reason we gave. As soon as the Jewish people no longer lived up to that reason, there would be no love. But since God's love relationship of covenant to the Jewish people is unconditional, we can never really fathom the depth of God's choice of them. It's very, very important. Now, when we start to realize this, so we got to go back and see what this means. In other words, when we're very young, what our parents do for us or to us, how they treat us, basically creates the strengths and vulnerabilities that we have to live with for the rest of our lives. It's very interesting. According to the Talmudic definition, there's a reason why God chose the Jewish people. They said Nasa v'nishma. That's all. They said, we're ready to accept unconditionally whatever you say. Fine. According to the Kabbalistic understanding, there is no reason that God somehow programmed all the nations in the world not to be able to accept the Torah, and the Jewish people He programmed to be able to accept the Torah. What His reason was is impossible to comprehend. If we say that the Jewish people were chosen because they said Nasa v'nishma for some reason that makes sense, then we say the Jewish people was chosen because they had a certain kind of relationship with God, which they recognized. They were thankful for what God did for them. He brought them out of Egypt. And so now they sort of paid back and showed a love, an unconditional love for God. Because after all, God had shown an unconditional love for them by just taking them out of the mire and muck of Egypt. In other words, it's a two-way street. It's a kind of responsibility. You know, when a parent brings up a child, he's got to give the child a double message, right? On the one hand, the child has to be told, listen, kid, if you're 3 years old and you crossed against the light, you're going to get whacked. Right? If you don't eat enough of your supper, then you're not going to go out and play. The relationship a child has with a parent is based in good part on a give and take, a sort of mutual responsibility one to the other. And that's good, right? On the other hand, the child also has to know that the parent loves it unconditionally. Both messages have to be true. Therefore, you have two opinions in Chazal why the Jews were chosen. One has to do with a kind of mutual interaction of responsibility, and one has to do with an unconditional love that can never be fathomed. Again, two notions of chosenness. And it is that kind of thing that forms the structure of our whole psychic. The idea that on one hand we are responsible, and on the other hand we are loved. This forms the structure of all that we ever become. What happens if there's an erosion in that structure? What replaces it? What gives a man the balance that he has? What keeps him centered? Well, there are two things. One, well, let's put it this way. There is a notion of chesed in Hebrew. Chesed means mercy or kindness. There's a kind of kindness, joy, love of life that we receive by interacting responsibly with the things around us. I did a good job and I feel good. I worked hard and I earned a salary. I went on a diet and I lost weight, right? That's good. I feel good about it. It's the kind of chesed that's perceived as a result of relativism. Did you ever notice that it's impossible to be happy about anything unless you first were lacking that same thing? Right? In other words, I feel good because I got a raise in pay, but yesterday I didn't have it. Somebody was sick and now they get better, so they feel good. They feel God's kindness. Chesed, on the first level that we're talking about, has to do with a relative interaction on the basis of some kind of reason or responsibility interaction that pays off. That's chesed. There's another kind of chesed. Or another kind of love. That's called the Ahava Shebedas, the love of the mind. It has nothing to do with relativism. There's an experience of God's goodness and love that's beyond the realm of relativism. All right? You know, in modern mathematics, really the real up-to-date stuff, you know what they just discovered now? This crazy thing, it's called chaos theory. All right? You know what you can do in chaos theory? You can take a string of numbers, right, and put them together in such a way that when they bounce off each other, they will produce chaos. In other words, the mathematicians have discovered that no matter, show me a situation of chaos, and I will be able to show you a set of numbers from which that chaos is produced. You know what that means in philosophical terms? It means there's method behind madness. All right? It means there's purpose behind chaos. There's light behind darkness. You know what the Zohar says about God? That God is B'mali kol almin, V'sovav kol almin, V'lis asaf honin. That God fills all worlds, surrounds all worlds, and there's no place where He's not. About this we have a verse, Ein od bilvado. There's nothing but Him. From God's point of view, there's only Him. And yet the unity of God's life-giving force is perceived by each person or by each thing in which it is manifest in different ways. From out of the unity of God's life-giving force comes plurality. Oh, wow. That means that on a pluralistic level, on a level of science, on a level of art, on a level of personal enjoyment, love, kindness, the experience of goodness is totally relevant to how situations or things interact with themselves. Right? Well, what happens if I'm in a situation that, man, I'm in a checkmate? It looks like there's just no way out. My life situation is so chaotic that it seems absolutely hopeless. There is no way that one can even imagine that I can crawl out of where I'm at. And things can become better for me. Then on the level of relativism, it's impossible to experience chesed. But if I can make that quantum leap of faith, if I can realize that behind all chaos is chaos theory, that behind all confusion is purpose, behind all that exists, no matter how terrible or harsh certain things may seem, there's godly goodness. If I have that kind of faith, right, then I can experience the ahava shebedas, the love in the mind. Now, to experience the ahava shebedas, only God can fully do this. We can only glimpse it. I'll give you an example, but not to use this example. He says, you can understand that a woman loves her child. You might even be able to understand that a woman loves the child in her womb who doesn't have a personality yet, who she's never seen. But you're never going to be able to understand that a woman loves the idea of the child that will one day be in her womb. That's already impossible. And yet, God is capable of ahava shebedas. He's capable of loving the totality of all that exists in an ongoing manner, even before what He loves is made manifest. God can love the Jewish people when they're just a concept in His mind. And because He loves this concept of the Jewish people, He can go ahead and create the entire universe, knowing that that concept will one day be made manifest within this universe. In short, there's a sense of ahava shebedas that nobody can understand. There's a sense of purpose behind chaos, behind meaninglessness. When I sense that purpose, I can only sense it, glimpse it for an instant. I can never capture it. I can never rationalize it. I can never write it up and make it objectively rational. Somebody else should understand it. The Amish Abadas, the notion that God is the common denominator behind all that exists, and that His purpose is buried in all that is, no matter how seemingly chaotic, that notion is as incomprehensible as the notion of chosenness that we spoke about. Okay. Rabos machshavos belavish v'yatzas Hashem yisakum, as we say this in the prayers. Many thoughts go through the mind of man, and what God wants will ultimately happen. Okay. In other words, out of darkness will emerge a light. Out of chaos will emerge purpose. In the end of days, the greatness and chosenness of the Jewish people will be a light into the nations, like the verse proclaims in Isaiah. If I have this understanding in my heart, I can never be defeated. I'm strong. I know that there is a purpose behind everything that happens, whether I can relate to it or not. That's a tremendous strength of faith. If I understand as a Jew the value of my relationship with God, the beauty of His Torah, the power of my own ability to accomplish having been born a Jew, wow. What happens if a Molech comes and puts all of those things into doubt? What happens if I doubt my own chosenness, if I don't believe in God or the Torah or the greatness of the Torah? What happens if I really believe that circumstance are the totality of anything worth noticing? Then what gives me strength? I have to find something else that's innate. You know what that's going to do? Holiness. It's very subtle. It's going to be culture. It's going to be culture. In other words, I have a good job, I make money, I understand why I made money, I feel happy, I did a good job. I was ill, I got better, very nice. But what happens if things go wrong, if they're really chaotic? What keeps me centered? The fact that I shave every day. The fact that I still can appreciate makeup. The fact that I eat with a knife and fork that I put down in a certain way. Right? If you think about it, culture is something that is, the language that I speak in fact, culture is rooted in man in a way that is very, very subtle. It's very interesting because the Torah warns that you should not go in the ways of the cultures of the Goyim. Why were the Jews liberated from Egypt, according to rabbis? Because they never fully adopted the culture of the Egyptians. They didn't dress in the same way, they didn't stop speaking Hebrew, and they never stopped calling themselves by their Hebrew names. They did not fully assimilate with the culture of the Goyim, therefore there was hope for them yet. What does this mean when the rabbis tell us a thing like this? Very simple. You notice this word v'chukosei, in their ways. What is a chuk? You know, there's a mishpat. A mishpat is a law that makes rational sense. A chuk is a law that God gives us and doesn't reveal the reason for it. Like wearing woolen linen is a prohibition. It's a chuk. Kashrus is a chuk. Right? It's interesting that chuk means a law without a reason. When we are told not to follow in the culture of the Goyim, that culture is called b'chukosei. B'lashon chuk, because culture doesn't have a reason. Can you explain to me why you like Beethoven? And what happens if they put the fork and the knife down on the wrong sides of the blade? Is there really a reason why it must be here and not there? And if you don't eat with a napkin, or if you don't shave with a... I mean, I don't know. There are certain things that are ingrained in us that give us our centeredness, our security. And if those things are goyish, if they come from the nations of the world, then we can be sure one thing is true. In the end, they don't give us the security we need as Jews. Now don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to tell you that don't listen to Beethoven. I'm not trying to tell you that you should change the way that you eat. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying be aware that the habits of culture that we conform to on a regular basis, which give us the security, the inner psychological peace that we enjoy, is not the whole of our, or does not really form the basic structure of what keeps us together. What keeps us together should be a sense of our chosenness, a sense of our worthiness, a sense of the greatness of our Torah, unconditionally. When the Jewish people in the time of Shushan wanted to assimilate, how could they turn down a chance of being part of the elite? I mean, we always eat with a knife and fork, but to eat with a knife and fork at the table of Achashverosh, the king, with all of his ministers, it's a gewalt, right? How can you pass up an opportunity like that? Everything depends on it. It's the ultimate fulfillment of everything that keeps us centered. Right? And in the end, it falls apart. They go there, they live the culture to their fullest, and realize that they shouldn't have done it. That everything they were so proud of, everything they were aspiring to, the whole assimilation trip, ultimately was used against them. They were made mockery of. Their heritage was trampled on. Oh, wow. They had to adopt a whole different headspace now. A whole different headspace. I come from a whole different place. So I ask you, Esther was taken to Achashverosh's palace. Mordechai never got her back. And the Jewish people never told that she was a Jew or that she was Mordechai's wife. How could they have been so careful to keep this a secret? Why didn't Mordechai try to get her back? Number one, Mordechai was a man who was a great holy man. He recognized that there's two levels of consciousness. There's a relativistic level of consciousness. This is A is like this, and B is like that. As they come into conflict, we better straighten them out. Esther's my wife. She shouldn't really be in the palace. If she winds up in the palace, I better get her home. But Mordechai is also understanding that behind all chaos is purpose. Behind everything that happens that seems to be threatening, there is a God. There is chesed and there's Rav chesed. You know the difference? Chesed is kindness. Right? Kindness that is reflected from relative situations in our relationship. Rav chesed is all-encompassing, abundant chesed. V'atam bechaya es kulam. God, you give life to all things. You are around all things and in all things, and there's no place where you are not. If a person can perceive your presence, that's Rav chesed. The form in which that presence is made manifest is relative to who I am. But the fact that that presence is in all things is what counts. The purpose behind chaos, the belief in that purpose. Mordechai believed in that purpose. By the way, you know what? Mordechai, according to the Sefer Kabbalah, is Bigematria Rav chesed. Mordechai equals the words Rav chesed, God's abundant kindness. He's tuned in to chaos theory, to the theory behind the chaos. If God saw fit that my wife, of all people, is picked up off the street by mistake and brought to the palace, I'm not going to ask anybody. There's got to be a hidden purpose behind that. He just let us do it. Now, not everybody could get away with this. We would say, well, isn't there such a thing as responsibility? You see, but because he was Mordechai, he had that kind of sense of God. If he was a lesser person, it would have been counted against him. But he was who he was, and therefore it was not counted against him. But why did the Jewish people keep it quiet? Very simply, by the time they found out, they were already being threatened by Haman and extinction. And the Gezeres HaMelech had been passed, saying that they must die. The king had, basically said in a year from now, you have to kill all the Jews. Therefore, they said, hey, we got one of ours in the palace. Our sister is the queen. Let her stay there. Don't tell anybody she's one of the tribe. Maybe she'll use her influence and get us off the hook. That's actually hinted to in the Gemara Megillah. Gemara Megillah asks it this way. The Gemara says, why was it that Esther made a feast for Haman and Achashverosh twice before she brought down the boom, and really ended Haman's relationship with Achashverosh? Why did she invite them both to a feast and she let it be known, right? Very public thing. There are many opinions. One opinion in the Gemara is that Esther said to herself, you know what, my people are doing? They got a sister in the palace and she's going to get them off the hook. She's going to save them from the threat. I don't want them bending on me, I want them bending on God. So she made a feast and invited Haman and Achashverosh. When the people heard about this, they said, oh, she's one of them. She's totally assimilated. She's not going to do what we expected. And they all turned back to God. Okay. So, what's the difference between the story of the Yetzias Mitzrayim, of the Exodus from Egypt, and the story of Purim? When the Jewish people were liberated from Egypt, that's exactly what they were. They were liberated from Egypt. It was bad in Egypt, and God got them out and took them to someplace better. He took them from darkness to light. God said, listen, you guys are in trouble in Egypt. I'm going to get you out, and you're going to come into the desert, and then you can have a relationship with me. In the story of Purim, God doesn't take the Jews out of the place where they're threatened. Quite the contrary. God changes everything that threatens them into something that helps them. Right? In other words, in the story of Egypt, God takes them from darkness to light. In the story of Purim, God takes darkness and turns it into light. And therefore you can take the whole Megillah and literally cut it in half, right? And you will find every theme in the beginning, first half of the Megillah, that's an expression of threat, becomes an expression of joy and hope and thanksgiving in the second half of the Megillah. So just, to give you a couple of examples, right? In the beginning of the Megillah, the Jewish people are invited to a meal, which is bad. Gets them in trouble. At the end of the Megillah, everybody's making meals in celebration of the holiday, right? In the beginning of the Megillah, Haman convinces the king to kill the Jews. At the end of the Megillah, Esther convinces the king to save the Jews. In the beginning of the Megillah, messengers are sent out saying that on this and this day, everybody should lift up arms and kill the Jews in their communities, right? Within the 127 provinces governed by Achashverosh. At the end of the Megillah, message goes out from the same Achashverosh that the Jews are allowed to defend themselves, right? In the beginning of the Megillah, it says that Haman and Achashverosh sat down to drink. And the city of Shushan was really upset, right? At the end of the Megillah, it says that the city of Shushan was filled with joy. Right? So you see, one-on-one, the phraseology used to describe threat in the beginning of the Megillah is literally used once again to describe hope and thanksgiving. That is the theme of the Megillah, the nahafachu, that God turns light into darkness, to turn something over. It's the revelation of the theory behind chaos. It's a sudden glimpse of what no words can understand. Right? Now, you got to realize too. Now, why is it called the Megillah's Esther? Right? So the Gemara Chulin says, Esther min ha-Torah minaya. Where do you find Esther's name hinted in the Torah? This is an interesting exercise the rabbis are going through. Where do you see the name Esther hinted to in the Torah? Comes the answer, Anochi hasta astir. God says, I will hide myself. In other words, the rabbis are telling you that the root of the word Esther is seisa, to hide, to conceal. Right? Incidentally, that same Gemara says, Haman min ha-Torah minaya. How do you know that Haman, where is his name hinted in the Torah? So comes the answer, Hamin ha'etz. In other words, God says to Adam, after he ate from the tree, by Yomer, God says to him, Mi higid lecha, ki eramata. Who has told you that you are naked? Hamin ha'etz, asher tzavisicha levilti achal, mimenu achalta, except probably from the tree that I commanded you not to eat, you ate from it. That's how you know you're naked. But it's interesting. Hamin ha'etz. Now the Torah is not written with vowels. So Hamin is hey, mem, nun. If you put different vowels under it, it's Haman. So you see that Haman, Amalek, is connected right back to the sin of the Eitz Hadas Tovara, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is connected with the Nafish HaKedmoni, with the serpent that we talked about before. So it turns out that Esther comes from the word seisa, to hide. Right? Oh, if that's true, then what do we do on Purim? We read the Megillah's Esther. What does the Megillah mean? Well, the Megillah is a scroll, but the word Megillah comes from the word megaleh, to reveal. In other words, the Megillah's Esther, you can translate those words quite literally, to reveal the hidden. Because the story of Purim is a story in which the hidden is revealed, in which the theory behind chaos is glimpsed for an instant. You know what else is very strange about the Megillah? Why did the Jews get so excited? You know that this story didn't happen in 2 days. This happened in a good many years. And most Jews weren't even consciously aware of all the factors that were happening pertaining to this story until when the story was all over, Mordechai and Esther sat down and they wrote the Megillah and they sent it to every Jewish community in the provinces of Achashverosh. And then the Jews first found out, wow, look what happened. And if you read the Megillah, I mean, it's kind of normal. So there was Achashverosh, and he was influenced by Haman to want to kill the Jews, and eventually he got nixed because Esther, a Jewish girl, was taken into the palace by mistake. But the whole thing, I mean, God's name isn't even mentioned in the Megillah outwardly, because there's nothing miraculous about the story. And yet, the Jews who went through the story of the Megillah, who actually lived in Shushan and in those provinces that were under the dominion of Achashverosh, felt so strongly about what they had been through that they were koveya. They set up a holiday to be celebrated forever. They read the Megillah at the same time of year. They sing Shalach Manas. They rededicated themselves to the Torah. We'll talk more about that in a second. It seems that the enthusiasm, the amount of just rapture that the Jewish people were in as a result of this story is not equal to what we read in the story. It looks like they're trying, it's like there's more water in the glass than the glass can hold. If you just read the story of the Megillah, what's everybody getting so excited about? So it happened, okay. I mean, nothing, the Red Sea didn't split. Mountain wasn't picked up over our heads. I mean, a natural sequence of events seemed to take place that were a little weird, and that was it. Says the Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Gloria, he says, you know what happened? On Purim, Chochmah was revealed b'li. That inspiration was revealed without concept. In other words, normally, if I get an inspiration, how do I know I had one? Because I can tell you what it was about, right? And there's a concept that goes along with it. What happened on Purim was, Jews were inspired. They were uplifted. They glimpsed their own chosenness and God's greatness in a way that no words could hold or could explain or could give over. The experience of Purim was beyond what was written in the Megillah. And therefore the Megillah is an attempt to be Megillah the Esther, to explain how what was hidden was glimpsed and revealed for a moment. But we don't really understand what happened. We just know that somehow around this time of the year, when we celebrate Purim, the opportunity for that glimpse is there for us once again to perceive if we're worthy. If we're worthy. Therefore the rabbis teach us in the Gemara of Megillah that a person should get drunk on Purim till he doesn't know the difference between the phrase Baruch Mordechai, blessed be Mordechai, and Ora Haman, cursed be Haman. Because Mordechai and Haman as concepts are paralleling opposites. But if I get drunk to the point that I don't know the difference of paralleling opposites, then I'm coming to I'm bypassing the chesed, the sense of goodness that, boy, I'm from the tribe of Mordechai, and that's from the tribe of Haman. I feel real good about that, considering who these two people were in the relativistic sense. But on Purim, a person should get drunk and transcend that level. He should get drunk and come to the level of Ein Od Milvado, that there is purpose behind chaos. There's light hidden in darkness. That whatever I think the difference between the Jew and the Gentile may be, whatever I think the difference between Haman and Mordechai may be, whatever I think relatively there is to be joyous about in the fact that I am struggling with Torah and I have some kind of a commitment to God. Beyond that, there's so much more. Beyond that, there's an experience that's just one with He who is, with He who is, which is God, that is not made small or objectified by my own immediate responses or interactions. Normally, I relate to God in the terms of what I'm able to relate to. Who I am colors what I see. Whatever shortcomings there are in me ultimately keep me back from really experiencing what Torah is. On Purim, a person should get so drunk that he can glimpse the experience of Torah removed from his own subjectified self. Okay? And so now, and this is the beginning, this is the Megillah's aspect, to reveal, to glimpse the hiddenness. Now, why is it at the end of the story of Purim, Kimu v'kiblu ha-Yehudim, the Jews re-accepted, rededicated themselves to Torah, and as I explained before, that means primarily the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral law. Let me say this to you. There is a problem with the oral law. What is the problem with the oral law? Okay. Let's say we're learning Talmud. Anybody who's studying the Talmud, studying the Gemara, which is the oral law, understands what I'm saying. It's part of the experience. In the Talmud, there are many discussions to take place. We're trying in the course of these discussions to clarify what God expects of us, how God wants us to relate to the written Torah, to the Bible. How to apply laws to contemporary situations, so on and so forth. And so there are many debates and discussions throughout the Talmud. Now, these debates are all extremely logical. And as soon as somebody in the Talmud comes up with something that isn't logical, then he's shot down immediately and dispensed of. There's no room for things that are not really logical in the Talmud. The problem with the Talmud goes like this. Supposing you have two great teachers like Hillel and Shammai. Hillel says, this thing is perfectly permissible on Shabbos. Shammai is banging on the table. He says, I'm telling you, this thing is absolutely prohibited on Shabbos. So you ask Hillel, how do you know this thing is permissible on Shabbos? He will quote you a verse from the Bible, and he will analyze that verse from a particular perspective in such a way as to prove from the verse that this thing is absolutely permissible. Comes Shammai, and he says, I disagree with him. He will take the exact same verse very often and analyze it from a somewhat different perspective and prove to you concretely and absolutely that the thing in question is prohibited. Now, there's no way that either of these arguments can be challenged. They are both absolutely rational and self-contained, and given the fact that I'm allowed to interpret this verse by analyzing it from various points of view, then both points of view are both logical, rational, and ultimately acceptable. But they produce two diametrically opposed positions. So who's right? Hillel or Shammai? If you ask Hillel, do you think Shammai has a right to view that verse and interpret it from the position he does? Hillel will say absolutely. If you ask Shammai, do you think Hillel's got a right to his opinion? He's going to say, of course. Right? But they disagree. So how do we know what the law is? We take a vote. We get the rabbis together. And however the rabbis vote in terms of their majority, that is the law. And here we have a concept of Yochid v'Rabbim halacha k'Rabbim, that whenever you have a majority over an individual or a few individuals, the law always is like the majority. Now here's the catch though. When the rabbis decide, for example, that they prefer Hillel's point of view than Shammai's, on what basis are they making this decision? Do they think that Hillel is more logical than Shammai? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe they merely feel that it's easier to live with Hillel's point of view than Shammai's. There's nothing that governs why the majority should choose to abide by the opinion it abides by. Of course, Hillel and Shammai, in terms of discussing their questions and presenting their arguments to begin with, have to conform to certain rules. They have to conform to the laws of the Torah in terms of its interpretation, the 13 methods of interpreting the Torah. They have to be fully aware of what is already tradition and established and what was given outside. There are all kinds of things that will sort of limit what Hillel and Shammai can argue about. There are certain things out of bounds. They can't just invent any law or think up any peculiar way of looking at things and have it become a law or present it even as an opinion. There are things that govern how their argument works. In other words, in order to play chess, you have to know the rules. That's the problem with the Reform and the Conservative rabbinate. They don't play by the traditional rules of Judaism. Thus, in a sense, when they come up with a new law, they very often have come up, in fact, with a new type of religion. But if we're going to play the game according to the traditional, accepted way that the game was always played, then even then, we can come into a place where we don't know who was right, Hillel or Shammai. In which case, we have to rely on the majority to decide. But the majority can decide any way they want for any reason they want. Therefore, is anybody trying to tell us that majority makes right? No. Nobody will say that because the majority of rabbis chose to abide by Hillel's opinion, that Shammai is existentially wrong. In fact, the rabbis will come around and say, after the Messiah comes, for all we know, we might even do it like Shammai. It's just that we, the rabbis, have not only the right, but we have the obligation to reach a conclusion and decide who's right, Hillel or Shammai. And it's an article of faith that God waits in heaven for the rabbi's decision, and whatever they decide becomes the law for the Jewish people. God will abide by the decision of the rabbis in majority. Now, we think into that deeply. You see, there's two things going on. On the one hand, we're saying that the collective intellectual consciousness of the Jewish people is so closely related to God that it can be relied upon to bring light out of chaos, to say what the law is when you have two paradoxically opposite opinions, both of which are irrefutably right within their own dimension. Yet the Jewish relationship to God is so strong that its collective intellectual consciousness or unconsciousness can be relied upon to show a path toward relating to God even amid a circumstance like that. That's number one. Number two is even more sneaky. If you really think about it still, you realize that form doesn't make any difference. That God doesn't care in the ultimate end if you don't do this thing like Shammai would have you not do it on Shabbos, or if you do it, it's permissible like Hillel. He doesn't care ultimately that you must do it this way, it's been decided in heaven. Oh no. The form the law takes can be like Hillel or like Shammai. Both Hillel and Shammai, whatever they say, are words of and expressions of the living God. But the decision of which form lies with the rabbis ultimately, when Hillel and Shammai can't decide amongst themselves. That means that in the eyes of heaven, form is arbitrary. And we become responsible to whatever form the rabbis collectively agree we should adhere to. But in the eyes of heaven, God couldn't care less if the rabbis decide like Hillel or decide like Shammai. It doesn't really matter. Form is absolutely arbitrary. Which way you're going to do it. But God says, what the rabbis tell you, that becomes binding. But as far as I'm concerned, it's arbitrary. Form doesn't make any difference at all. Now we understand why the Jews who left Egypt had trouble with the oral Torah. What was the experience of the Jews who left Egypt? They were taken from darkness to light. They were liberated from the place of persecution and brought out to a place of freedom. In other words, form means everything. We couldn't worship God in Egypt. The darkness of Egypt wasn't going to turn into light. It matters form. There's an absolute place where we can't worship God and an absolute place where we can worship God. Therefore, when they were confronted with the notion of Torah Sheba'al Peh, an oral law, which ultimately in many instances is decided by a rabbinic majority, which proves, as we have explained, that form is arbitrary in the eyes of God, that didn't sit well. It didn't conform to what their experience of God had been. Therefore, God threatened them with the mountain and said, you got to accept it. The Gemara says that wasn't fair, so the Gemara says, don't worry about it. At the time of Mordechai and Esther, the Jewish people re-accepted the Torah willingly. Why? Because in the story of Mordechai and Esther, we saw v'dahafachu. We saw that everything that was threatening could become something that was encouraging. We saw that the Jews didn't have to leave Shushan to be saved. They could stay in the place of darkness and watch the darkness itself become light. We could see when they were in a checkmate that things could be altered by some kind of theory behind chaos in a way that was ultimately for their good, even though that process was something that they were totally unaware of as it was happening and didn't make any rhyme or reason. It couldn't have been predicted what was going to happen there. And so that's the lesson, basically, of the story of Purim. The story of Purim, the rabbis say in the Yerushalmi, is going to be the major holiday after the Messiah comes. Every other holiday is going to remain, but it's going to be demoted to a place of minor meaning. And the Ikar holiday, the main holiday, is going to be the holiday of Purim. The Zohar comments when the Jewish people left Egypt, look, they snuck out in the dead of night. That was kind of very disgraceful. It wasn't, they weren't, it should have been in broad daylight, they should have had it should have been music playing. They snuck out like thieves in the middle of the night because they truly didn't deserve to be delivered out of Egypt. They were idolatrous in many ways. They had very few merits. God let them be delivered out of Egypt because they had great ancestors. But when Mashiach comes, and the Jews are going to lead the nations of the world out of darkness. They're going to be a light unto the nations. They're going to have a place that's esteemed and glorious. The depth of their chosenness will be recognized by them and by all of humanity. What can never be understood in terms of words, what can't be rationalized in terms of ideas, will be experienced as it was very briefly during the time of Mordechai and Esther in the city of Shushan.